It sounds like a very simple task that he's given us, but in fact it's very, very hard to try and encapsulate in 20 minutes a coherent summary of one's memories in this kind of situation or city. But I'll try to do this. I'll probably ramble along a little bit, so I hope you'll excuse me. And hopefully maybe when the conversation starts afterwards, I'll be perhaps more coherent in response to some of the concerns that some of us, yourselves included, have. And before I begin, though, I want to thank Hannah for inviting me. This is the second time I come to this museum.
I forgot to say that also Sari is not a newcomer to Hohenems.
Not a newcomer at all. I came once before. So I more or less know this place now quite well. It's very small, so one can know it very quickly. And it really has been a fascinating experience for me. I don't think I've gone into many Jewish museums. I haven't sought as an individual to go into Jewish museums. But I have found myself visiting some, and this one has certainly captured my attention and my imagination. And I tell people, my colleagues, when I go home, that there's something here that one can learn from and about. To go back to what I might say, I want to start by perhaps saying that I lived a very conflicted life, because on the one hand there was the constant desire on my part to relate to people, other people, as a normal human being might relate. I was exposed from early on in my life to the world at large, partly because of my family, which was all over the place, and so I was able to experience a much larger space of geography than many people did who were of my age and who grew up with me. And in a sense, therefore, I wanted to be the kind of person that could relate to all those things I discovered or saw around me. And by things, I include buildings, architecture, music, literature, individuals. I wanted to relate myself to all of this on the one hand. And on the other hand, this is the source of the conflict I mentioned. On the other hand, I also grew up in an environment which somehow imbibed me with, impressed upon me, that I was a very special person. Of course, we all are brought up to feel we are very special persons by our parents. But by this in particular, I meant or mean a special person for being or belonging to the family I belong to. And just to give you an example, I think Hannah already mentioned this. I was brought up to believe that I have an ancestress who has a name. And this ancestress has the name that my family name is. And that she was a woman, a fighter, and that she was one of the early women who stood by the Prophet Muhammad when he, why do you laugh? When he, well, you know, this is a story, right? When he moved out of Mecca, where he was being harassed, to Medina, which is the next town which welcomed him. Now, when he did this, he was met by a few individuals representing the tribes and families of Medina. And it's interesting that 4 of the people that first received him and gave him support was this woman, Nusseibeh. And the story then continues with Nusseibeh, in fact, later being involved in the battles with him, in at least 2 battles where she defended him with her body and with her sons. And the story then continues into the coming to Jerusalem with supposedly the first caliph. And I was brought to believe, therefore, that that I'm not myself in a way, that I am only a small speck in something that is much longer, much bigger, much more historic, beginning somewhere in ancient history, and just happening to now be aware or self-aware in the particular age and particular situation I was experiencing or living in. So for me, being myself was, being this long line. And until now, this sense of me, of my identity, is somehow entangled in this historic kind of lineage. Whether it is true or not has become irrelevant, because just as I believed one day when my parents told me when I was little, and I would go and sit with them in bed, and it would be early morning and the birds outside would be chirping, and they would tell me, "Listen, Sari, they are saying good morning to you." And I believed it, and I believed it so strongly that much later, when I was more than 20 years old, and I had come back one day to visit them from university, and I was having breakfast with them, and they told me, my parents, "Do you remember, Sari, how we used to laugh at you or with you and tell you that the birds were coming to say good morning to you?" And it took me maybe 2 or 3 seconds now to believe them in what now they were telling me, because the belief that the birds were saying good morning to me was actually much stronger and had been in my mind for all these 20 years. And it was difficult for me now to throw out this belief and to, take in this other belief that was in fact caused by the words of the very same people, my parents. So you can imagine how hard it is to grow up, whether it is true or not, to have in one's identity this full range of stories taking you all the way back. It makes you unable to feel that you are independent in a way, or that you are a master of yourself in the normal way one wishes normally to be independent and a master of themselves. So there was this part. And growing up in Jerusalem, the other part was the fact that I was growing up as I grew up, as they say, right on the sim or on the green line, or the line that divided East from West Jerusalem from 48 or 49 until 67. And, the Mandelbaum Gate and all of that was literally just at the other end of the garden of the house where I grew up. And I would play in the garden, and I would look across what was called no man's land. And even the term, whether it's in English or as I learned it in Arabic or maybe in other languages, is a very sinister kind of term, no man's land. What is no man's land? Whose land? No man's land. It's a very strange concept. And I'd look across and I'd see on the other side the quarter of Mea Shearim, which I conceived to be the be-all, end-all of the Jewish people. And very often, as I would look across no man's land at that scene, I would see people at the other end standing, looking back at me and at whoever was with me. And otherwise, for me, the Jewish people had no existence except for the fact that which I saw at the other side of no man's land had somehow or another been behind the misery, the cause of the misery that my family had gone through, which takes me now to why I was born in Damascus, because at the time my father was involved in the fighting of 48-49. He'd lost a leg. He was taken off to have his leg amputated. My family, my mother's family, who with her mother had to leave Ramle. Before that, they were in another place called Wadi. So they were basically a group that had moved out of their places, which are now in Israel, moved out during the war to Lebanon, and then from Lebanon to Damascus, where I was born. And then, by then, my father was in Cairo. My father at the time was working as the secretary of the first, what they called All Palestine government, that was created at the time. And he came back to Jerusalem, and so I practiced my right of return with him when I came back when I was 2 years old, I suppose, to grow up in Jerusalem. So, to go back to the no man's land, in 1967, the first thing I did, I wasn't in the country when the war erupted, but I came back soon afterwards, and the first thing I did in 1967 was to jump from the wall of the back garden into the street, which was the line of no man's land, where Mendelbaum, where now there's this major railway and everything. And I started walking towards the place I used to look at as I was growing up, which was Mea Shearim. And then with each few steps I would stop and I would turn and I would look back at my house. And I can't tell you how piercing this experience was, piercing in me and in my self-identity, as I walked every few steps, turned back, and looked at and tried to imagine what I must have looked like, what the people on the other side, on the Jewish side, saw as they looked at us and at me. And I would do this, cross this distance to the other side until I reached the street on the other side, and would then put myself in the position of the Orthodox Jews that I used to see looking at me from a distance, and whom I used to think of as something close to God's worst devilish creations, being the cause of the misery of the family as I grew up. So, by the way, this distance that I crossed back then in 1967 is a distance that I have to cross all the time. And for instance, today when I came to the museum and Hannah was showing me around, it's a distance one has to cross constantly to try and see things how they seem from the other side. And it's actually served me well in my relationship with my wife, because even in a marital relationship or in any kind of relationship, you have to cross this distance all the time and to try and see how you are or how you are viewed and how you seem from the other side. But to go back to the very beginning, to let you once again appreciate what I said about the conflictual identity. On the one hand, as I was saying, there was, that part of me that wished to relate to other people, to other cultures, as anybody would like. And on the other hand, I had these two things pulling me back, and which are still pulling me back. And one being this connection to an identity that is not really mine, but is an identity that belongs to a long line of family history with its own stories and its own fables and its own problems and conflicts, and another identity that pulls me in, that goes back into affirming for me the being a Palestinian. And of course, whether it is the being a Palestinian on the one hand or the being a Muslim on the other hand, in both cases, in Jerusalem, I live as a person who, even without anything, even assuming there is no violence whatsoever being perpetrated against me or against any of my people, it is a situation that makes me continue to suffer in different ways. So even assuming there's nothing, even assuming there's no soldiers, even assuming there's no violence, even assuming, whatever you like, the very fact that within me, my identity is connected in these ways